The announcement came before dawn, when the twin suns still hid behind the horizon, and the tidal flats of Neros breathed out a faint, mineral chill. He stood on the deck of the coastal training platform with salt prickling his lips and the hum of the perimeter pylons shivering through his boots, and he watched the instructor's drone rise on a column of blue air. The drone's lens irised open with a click that felt like a verdict. "Cadets," the voice said, steady and metallic. "The solar flare test will commence within one local day. Flare intensity forecast, extreme." A murmur broke along the line of mixed-species trainees, a ripple of armor plates, membranes, gill fans, and cloth sleeves. He kept his shoulders square and his hands still, because every nervous gesture would feed the rumor machine that already painted him as fragile. The ocean stretched out in a tarnished arc, shallow and treacherous, glassing over with a lacquer of morning light. Sometime in the next cycle, the suns would ignite the sky with a sheet of hard radiation that cracked composites and shattered pride. The test never killed, the instructors promised, because the platform's emergency field would lock down the moment a vital sign plunged too low. But the test scarred reputations. Cadets who panicked during a flare wore that panic like a second uniform for the rest of their careers. He understood that part with a quiet, stubborn clarity. He also understood that the planet had rules older than any academy, and those rules did not care whether a cadet's blood was iron or copper or saline laced with calcium. The wind shifted. A brine smell rolled over the deck, braided with a faint vegetal sweetness blooming out of the flats. He looked past the pylons to the shallows and saw the low tide had left the substrate tattooed with contour lines and stranded pools. In the pools, dark mats rose and fell, thick as felt and ridged like muscle. He had heard about the algae during the briefing, although the instructor had not spent many words on it. Neros hosted a photosynthetic complex that turned ultraviolet fury into sugar and heat into growth. Locals called it knellweed because at full noon it paled to the color of bone and rang under a tapping finger like a stretched drum. He filed the detail away because that was what he did when nerves pressed at his ribs. He collected small, useful facts and let them sit until a situation demanded a key. A shadow fell across his boots. Sorsk, a chitin-shouldered veteran from a high-gravity furnace world, leaned in with the easy contempt of someone whose epidermis could shrug off sparks. "Human," Sorsk said, mandibles clacking around the vowels. "Do not worry. The med field will freeze you before you cook. We will keep a sample jar for what remains." A pair of avian cadets laughed, feathers quivering. He did not give Sorsk the satisfaction of a retort. He glanced at the instructor instead. Commander Ulin stood with her hands behind her back, posture as spare as an annotation. A scar cut a diagonal across her cheek, a pale parenthesis that framed a mouth that did not smile. "Save the bravery for the test," she said, with no need to raise her voice. "You will each have one standard pack, one shelter module, and your issued sensor mesh. No additional armor, no off-world augments. The platform field will trigger only at critical thresholds. Survive the duration. Return with your logs. That is all." The line broke apart in orderly fragments. Cadets checked seals, ran diagnostics on the mesh lattices that would map their vitals, and traded last-minute barbs disguised as banter. He collected his pack from the supply rack and felt the lightness of it with a flicker of doubt. The shelter module fit in his palm, a wafer of folded material that could auto-expand into a reflective teepee with a soft keystroke. He turned it over, let the gull-gray sheen catch the strengthening light, and pictured that sheen creasing under a flare. He had seen composite sheeting fail under a welder's torch on a shipyard back home. Heat did not negotiate. Heat remembered only itself. He sealed the pack, shouldered it, and drifted toward the rail. The ocean hissed against the pilings in short syllables, tidal breath and electric hum. He watched a school of translucent fish wheel under the platform, each body stitched with biolights like a diagram of nerves. A memory rose uninvited. A porch back on Earth. Night laid over the yard like a shawl, his grandmother tracing constellations with one work-gnarled finger. She had told him about old farmers who read weather out of cloud color and animal stillness, who checked pond scum not because it mattered to dinner, but because pond scum changed when storms rolled in. He had laughed then, and she had laughed too, but later she had tapped a glass jar of algae he had scooped out of a ditch and said, "Even slime tells you what the world will do if you listen." He felt the old warmth of that memory sit under his ribs like a hand. Sorsk thumped past and jumped the last step to the dock that extended toward the flats. Others followed. He dropped into line without speaking. The instructors wanted each cadet to scout personal positions and identify fallback options before the flare warning. The Academy had uploaded mapped hazard zones to every wrist unit. Micro-faults that breathed toxic gas when compressed, sink pockets hidden under smooth crust, shell mounds riddled with burrowers that reacted badly to vibration. He studied the map until the colors sank behind his eyes, then held the world in bare sight. The flats stretched low and wide, with knotted ridges of polymerized sediment rising a few centimeters above the water and with mirrors of brine caught between them. The mats lay in those mirrors, black-green under morning and brown-green where a thin scum of silt dusted the surface. He crouched at the edge of one pool and slid a gloved hand under the mat. It resisted like a living thing, then yielded, heavy with trapped water. His suit's back panel tasted the chemistry and fed him a string of quiet notes, high in complex pigments, layering micro-baffles under the surface, high in minerals that soaked ionizing energy the way a dry cloth soaked a spill, porous enough to breathe when water backed it. He lifted the edge higher and a sunbeam skittered along the wet fibers, almost swallowed, almost gone. Commander Ulin's boots clicked behind him. He stood, shook brine from his glove, and faced her. She did not ask questions. She looked past him at the pool, then at the drifting mats that bumped the lip of the shore, and gave the smallest nod, the kind that could be mistaken for a cough if a cadet needed to be spared a wave of mockery. He returned the nod because gratitude that showed could be gouged. He walked the flats with the sun climbing at his back, and he listened to how the world changed with every minute. Insects skimmed the pools in long, unbroken stitches, and birds traced pitch arcs over the marsh, quiet and intent. On the reef line, spires of knellweed lifted in strands and laid down again as if the ocean breathed through them. He palmed open small test tabs from his pack, wet each strip on his glove, slid the tabs into the mat edge, into the shallow water under the mat, into the air under the lip of a rock ledge where heat pooled. The strips came up with gradients that did not surprise him. The air under the ledge spiked high even now, with the sun still low. The water under the mat sat cooler than the open pool by several degrees, and the air just above the mat registered less ultraviolet than the air a hand's breadth away. Facts, he told himself, not miracles. The Academy loved to call survival an art, but he had learned to love the science that made art repeatable. A trio of avian cadets angled in to claim a ridgeline. The tallest among them twitched a wing toward his pack. "Human," she said, voice a flute with a reed scrape. "The shelter module reflects 98% in controlled conditions. What will your garden scum do when the flare climbs past forecast? Sing you a lullaby?" The second cadet barked a laugh. He could have said that reflective sheeting failed under micro-tears and that wind ground grit into any crease, or that a mat that ate light did not need a zipper. He could have said that he did not plan to rely on one thing when the test rewarded redundancy. He did not say any of that. "Good luck," he said instead, and meant it. She blinked, uncertain, and he moved on. By noon, the platform had shrunk to a bright square on the horizon, and the flats had warmed enough to glint. He sat on the lee side of a low knoll and ate a ration bar that tasted like sweetened cardboard and salt. He watched heat shivers run across the air in lizard-tail waves. His wrist unit buzzed with a new update, a disturbance in the sun's outer field that shifted the forecast upward again. A cluster of cadets groaned. Sorsk thumped his chest plates and yelled something about glory loud enough to make the birds lift and resettle. Commander Ulan's response came back calm and clipped. Choose backup positions now. He drank, capped the bottle, and slid his palms along the matte edge to feel where it thickened naturally. It thickened where the water slowed behind a rock lip and where wind had piled fragments over months. It thickened where fish had nibbled and left regenerative threads to fuse again. That meant he would not need to drag as much if he worked with the pools instead of against them. He mapped 3 positions in his head: a shallow basin with an overhang of mineral crust that could shield from slant, a deeper bowl where mats gathered in a natural braid, and a narrow slot closer to the reef where he could wedge a mat and a shelter in layers. He marked each on his wrist without broadcasting the markers to the group net. The rules did not forbid private notes, and he had learned that shared markers could become battlegrounds at the wrong moment. Afternoons slouched toward evening with the measured arrogance of a predator that did not need to run. Heat burned off skin and suit in slow radiation. He practiced the movements he would need if the warning siren cut the quiet: how to scoop a mat without tearing it, how to fold the shelter module under the mat so a reflective layer sat below an absorptive one, how to breathe shallow and slow when the air around the mat grew humid and close. He did it until his thighs trembled and his shoulders burned, until the motions slid into his body in the same groove as tying a knot in the dark. A pair of med drones skimmed past, silver and silent, and he wondered in a passing flash whether the test had ended anyone's career so early that a cadet had packed for a shuttle home before dawn. He shook the thought off like a mosquito. Sunset poured a sheet of copper over the flats. The mats shifted from green-black to a bruised purple, as if the light had sunk into the fibers and settled there. The platform horn sounded the evening call. Cadets began to drift back in long strings, sun-flushed and loud, egos stretched taut by a day with no catastrophe. He took one last look at the pools, at the folds that would matter when brightness turned violent, and he turned for the dock. On the deck, Commander Ulan met each cadet's gaze with the same flat, measuring look. She paused by him, and for a beat the hum of the pylons fell into the space between them. "You made 3 maps," she said, not a question. He considered denying it and let the impulse pass. "Yes, Commander." "Good," she said. "Singular plans break." She moved on. He watched her go and felt the small, clean click of a thought finding a mate. He would not bet his life on a single layer, not on a thin, reflective sheet, not on a mat alone, not on a rock lip alone. He would braid the planet's own habits into a shelter and tie that braid to the little human tricks his grandmother had taught him, the ones that sounded like folklore until someone measured them. Night came down with fast hands. Stars burned in the spaces between high streamers. The suns crouched just beyond the edge of the world like wrestlers on a mat, waiting for the whistle. He lay in his bunk with the drone's announcement replaying in his head: flare intensity forecast. Extreme. And he listened to the familiar clatter of cadets resetting gear into lines that made sense to nervous minds. He thought of the first breath he would take under a mat if the air grew wet and heavy, how he would count heartbeats to keep panic from kicking holes in reason, how he would keep his hands slow because slow hands saved lives when bright things lost their minds. He slept and woke and slept again, and when the alarm finally cut the morning quiet, he stood into his suit with no wasted motion. The ocean smelled like metal and flowers. Somewhere far beyond sight, the suns had turned their faces toward the world, and the world braced for a lesson that burned and did not apologize. He tightened the last seal and stepped out into the growing light with the cadence of his grandmother's advice in his bones, a rhythm of observation and patience that sounded, in his memory, exactly like a heartbeat. The warning siren began as a thin, almost apologetic tone and climbed until it pressed against his teeth. He stepped out into a morning that had misplaced its shadows. The twin suns still hid low, yet the light already felt brittle, as if the air had been tempered in a kiln. A haze hung over the flats, not fog, but a shimmer that bent edges into mirages. He moved with practiced economy, pack-balanced, shelter module riding inside the crook of his elbow, wrist unit set to a tight-band log that would record skin temperature, ambient radiation, and micro-fractures in the suit's outer layer. Commander Ulan stood at the rail with her hands clasped behind her back. She did not speak. She watched each cadet cross the gangway with the same searching stillness a falcon brought to a sky full of options. He met her eyes for a heartbeat, took the permission in that flash, and jogged down the dock toward the flats. By the time his boots hit sediment, the siren had cut off, replaced by a forward-canted silence. The sound of water had thinned, as if the ocean had decided that noise would give too much away. Heat pressed in low waves. He set a steady pace toward the basin he had marked as Position 1 and forced breath into a shallow cadence. In the middle distance, Sorsk stamped out a rectangle and snapped his shelter module open with a flourish, reflective walls flashing like a signal mirror. Two avian cadets peeled to a ridge and staked their teepee into a tight V to face the prevailing wind. A cephalopod cadet sluiced across a nearby pool and curled under a rock ledge where brine dripped in regular drops. The readiness of each move had the clean click of a plan sliding into place. He felt the pull toward speed and tamped it down. The flare would punish impatience more reliably than it punished caution. The first real sign came as a flicker that had nothing to do with visible light. His wrist unit jumped, numbers climbing in a stair-step that meant the suns had thrown off precursor particles. He pulled the shelter wafer to full size and snapped a single anchor to keep it from skating in the wind, then left it propped and half open like a fan. He needed it as a layer later, not as a tent now. He skirted a shallow pool and knelt by a mat that had thickened into a lumpy oval against a lip of sediment. When he slid his hands beneath the rim, the plant fought him with the stubbornness of an animal that had no wish to be lifted. He shifted grip and used the water itself to do the work, lifting with a slow roll so the mat rode the current rather than tearing. The underside came up slick and dark, laced with rootlets that trailed like hair. He levered a shoulder under the edge and walked half a circle to free it. The mat sighed when it slid free and fell across his forearms like a heavy blanket that breathed. Light shifted. He did not need the wrist unit for that. The hue tilted toward a color that did not belong in any dawn, a hard, thin brightness that made the flats look drawn with a blade. A shout snapped from the ridge where the avian cadets had pitched their shelter. One anchor had pulled. The sheet flapped and rang with a tinny beat, and a corner snapped in the wind and struck a feathered cheek with a flat, bright slap. The cadet laughed, bravado blooming when fear begged for a patch, and yanked the corner down. He looked once and then away. He had nothing to spare for a fix delivered at a distance with an opinion. He flipped his mat half over itself, checked the water trapped in the fold, and heaved the lump toward the shallow basin where mineral crust arched. The weight bit his hands. His suit fed him small warning pips as micro-abrasion climbed on the knuckles. He slowed. Rushing would buy him a torn plant and a lost shield at the moment he needed it most. The radiation ticked up again. Heat came with it, not in a normal arc of morning warmth, but as a fast-forward push that made skin under the suit prickle. He slid the mat against the basin lip and left it there, then jogged to a second pool where a braid of smaller mats had gathered. He plucked the braid free in sections, like a fisherman lifting a net full of kelp, and carried those sections back. 2 trips, then 3. On the 4th, he heard Sorsk call his name with exaggerated cheer. He did not answer. The 5th trip hurt his forearms, and the tendons across his collarbones sang with a thin, bright pain. He set the last section down and checked his log. Air temperature had jumped another 3 degrees in minutes. The suit recorded ultraviolet spikes in staccato bursts that made no sense for a normal sunrise. He knew enough physics to understand the shape of what he could not see. Charged particles were peeling electrons off molecules in the air, punching chemistry into brittleness. Composites would creep toward failure lines where seams did not sit quite flush. Reflective films would do their job until a breath of grit wrote a hairline scratch that became a ladder for heat. He did not hate the shelter sheet for its limits. He just refused to ask it to be something it could not be. He unrolled the shelter inside the basin, pinned two corners with fist-sized rocks, and left the sheet draped so a reflective face sat under where the mat would go. He wanted a sandwich of safeguards, reflected from below and absorbed from above, with water to carry the rest away. He dragged the big mat up over the lip. The plant made a wet, throatless sound as water drained out of the fold. He spread it with his hands until it hung like a dark roof over the shelled curve of crust. He tucked the edges with careful fingers, nested the smaller braid pieces along the windward reach to thicken that side, and leaned his forearms into the mass to feel how it settled. Coolness rose from the basin itself, a faint exhalation from the sediment. The combination spoke to the part of his mind that loved balances. He could hear his grandmother again, soft and practical. Let things do what they already want to do. The suns cleared a sliver more of horizon. The world flared white at the edges of things. A new shout broke from the ridge. The avian cadet who had joked at dawn stood with her shelter corners in her hands. She had turned the sheet twice to catch an angle that simply did not exist anymore. Light curled around the reflective surface and bit at the seams where her stakes met fabric. He saw the moment she realized it. Her mouth flattened into a line that might have been a prayer. She crouched and tucked the shelter low and fast, raking handfuls of wet silt over edges to bury the fabric in place. Good, he thought, almost involuntarily, because he respected speed that came with humility. He returned to his own work because respect did not put shade over his skin. The wrist unit hummed with a tone he had not yet heard on this world. The numbers that marked flux climbed until the rightmost digit blurred with speed. He felt heat through the suit, not as a burn, but as a swell that turned the air into syrup. A med drone whispered across the flats and stretched a silver tendril toward Sorsk's shelter, then retracted when Sorsk snapped a gauntlet in warning. The drone hovered, indecisive in a way that did not feel like code. He understood later that the drone had measured a superficial flaw and gambled on triage capacity. He did not spare thought now. He knelt and slid under the lip of mat and crust to test the air. Cool rinsed his cheeks where the suit seals funneled a controlled leak. The light turned to a green that stained his eyelids. He lay on his side and listened. Water ticked under the mat in tiny streams. The plant fibers creaked as they tightened, a sound like old rope taking a load. He counted breaths until his heart settled, then wriggled out again to lash the windward edge with a cord that he anchored through the crust with a thin spike. Heat climbed another rung. The flats beyond his little shelter went to light that had stopped pretending to be day. A few cadets still moved in the open, intent on last-minute patches. A tall amphibian cadet staggered and fell to one knee beside a shallow pool, paused, then rolled into the water with a practiced twist. Bubbles stitched to the surface in a neat line, and the cadence of those bubbles steadied in a rhythm that made sense. The amphibian had found a crevice in the sediment and wedged his gills across a trickle that would stay cold longer than surface brine. Good again, he thought, and then the world made a noise like a struck bell. The flare proper arrived. He did not need the instruments to tell him. The air hardened with a pressure that was not pressure, a psychic sensation that crawled the scalp and hummed in the joints. A line of small shells on a nearby ridge cracked in a run, pop after pop, as trapped moisture flashed. His shelter sheet tensed. A corner lifted and tried to peel. He dropped flat and shoved that corner down with both palms and elbowed another rock into place. For a breath and another, he felt the light on his back as a hand that pushed with no fingers. The suit beeped a warning, one tone only, not the frantic harmonic that would precede a field snap. He grinned, teeth bare without humor, and rolled under the mat with a practiced slide, bringing the cord with him, dragging the edge until it sat right against the crust, until no stupid gap remained for a clever photon to pry. Inside, sound changed. The world went to muffled heartbeats and the soft, regular rasp of the pump that circulated suit coolant. Green light soaked everything. He tucked the cord beside his thigh, found the water bottle by touch, and took a measured sip. He pressed his wrist unit against the underside of the mat. Radiation numbers dropped in an instant and stayed low, not zero but acceptable, sliding between tolerable and prudent with the stubborn steadiness he had hoped for. He let breath out and tasted the faint tang the plant gave off, a mineral sweetness that reminded him of rain on hot stone. He smoothed his hand along the mat and felt heat sliding across fibers into water, felt the plant work like a calm animal accepting a yoke. Gratitude came up unexpected and sharp. He whispered a thank you that made no sound and counted slowly to 60 twice to make sure the gratitude did not turn to arrogance. He lay on his back and watched a single filament dangle just above his nose, the end trembling with each faint gust that sneaked under the edge. He checked suit seams by touch. No grit sat against his neck ring. No edge had curled at the wrist. He flexed fingers and toes in small arcs to keep blood honest. Outside, the crackle of overstressed composites came and went, the little deaths of seams that had been almost good enough. Far to his left, someone shouted a name in a voice that broke on the second syllable. The med drone went that way so fast it left a fishtail wake in air, as if air could remember a passage. He shut his eyes and let the shelter teach him its rhythm. Plant, water, rock, film, flesh. Layer on layer, none heroic, all sufficient. Time slid. He did not trust his sense of it. He trusted the wrist. He touched the faceplate and brought up a small readout. Minutes had crawled a few boxes. The suns would hold the world on a spit for hours yet. He did the small things that prevented big mistakes. He counted breaths and sips. He shifted once to keep a hip from going to sleep and did it so slowly that the mat did not fuss. He listened for edges that rattled and heard none. He imagined the open flats turning to a white sheet and refused to let the image get teeth. He thought instead of ponds at home, of cattails and mosquito halos, of his grandmother's hand on a glass jar. He smiled into the green light, a brief lift at the corner of his mouth that did not pull anything loose, and let the chapter of danger turn at its own speed while he kept to the line he had drawn for himself. Observe, adjust, endure. The green glow beneath the mat deepened until it felt less like light and more like the memory of light. Heat still pressed from above, a steady, smothering weight, but inside his small shelter the air remained bearable. He kept his breathing slow and even, counting each inhale and exhale as if numbers could anchor his body to patience. The muffled world outside had no wind now, only the occasional crack or pop when something on the flats surrendered to the flare's punishment. Each sound was a reminder that his survival depended entirely on the integrity of his layered refuge. He reached out with one gloved hand and felt along the underside of the mat, searching for any sign of fraying or thinning. The fibers were still damp and firm, warm at the touch but not dangerously hot. That meant the algae was still absorbing the radiation, converting it into heat, and letting the water carry that heat away. It was a living shield, and it was holding. He took a slow sip from his water bottle, careful not to waste a drop. The warmth of the liquid in his mouth was strange. It tasted faintly of the plant's mineral scent, almost metallic but not unpleasant. The algae had likely infused the basin water over countless years, and now that same water was part of the barrier between him and the twin sun's wrath. He set the bottle back down and shifted his position to ease the ache in his hip. Moving in such a confined space meant planning every action, every inch of motion. A careless bump could lift an edge of the mat or dislodge a rock holding the shelter sheet in place. Outside, the silence broke with a sharp metallic ping, followed by the sound of something collapsing in the distance. He imagined another cadet's shelter giving way, reflective fabric folding in on itself as the flare's radiation found a weakness to exploit. The med drones would respond quickly, but not quickly enough to spare the sting of failure, and the sting to pride could be worse than the physical injury. He forced his mind away from speculation and back to monitoring his own situation. The humidity inside the shelter had risen noticeably, condensing on the inside of his visor. He reached up to wipe it with the back of his glove, a careful motion to avoid pressing the visor into the algae above. The filtered air smelled faintly sweeter now, as if the plant's biochemical processes had intensified under the increasing light. He knew enough biology to recognize this as a good sign. The algae was working harder, ramping up its pigment activity to shield itself, and in doing so, shielding him. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. His body ached from lying so still, but every time he thought about moving, the thought of loosening a seal or letting a shaft of light pierce the mat froze him in place. The outside world didn't feel real anymore. All reality existed in the dim green space, the sound of his breathing, and the muted thump of his heart against the padded suit. Then came the first direct challenge. A low, rattling vibration started under his right arm, subtle at first, then growing. He pressed his palm to the crust lip and felt it trembling. The flare's heat had been baking the mineral shell above the basin, and now a small crack somewhere nearby was letting a thermal draft push into his space. Warm air began to bleed in through the edge, not enough to scorch, but enough to disrupt the stable pocket of coolness he had built. He reacted without panic. Sliding onto his side, he pulled one of the smaller braid sections of algae closer and wedged it tightly into the space where the lip met the mat. The dense, damp weave sealed the gap, cutting off the draft. The temperature steadied within a minute, and he let out a slow breath. The fix held. Not long after, a sound like heavy cloth snapping in a gale ripped through the muffled quiet. He couldn't see it, but he imagined another cadet's reflective shelter tearing under stress. The flare was not just light. It was a constant assault, hammering every seam and edge, punishing arrogance and poor preparation alike. The algae above him shifted slightly as a gust of superheated air swirled across the basin. He pressed both hands upward, reinforcing the center to prevent any sag. Water droplets slid down his gloves, falling onto his chest and cooling instantly against the suit. He found comfort in that tiny reminder of the plant's resilience. Time inside the shelter was measured not by clocks, but by cycles of attention. Check the mat, adjust the cords, sip water, breathe, listen. He repeated this rhythm over and over, each loop anchoring him in the moment. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps or something moving in the shallows outside, but the sound faded quickly. It could have been a med drone scanning the flats, or it could have been nothing at all. The isolation played tricks. Eventually, the radiation readings on his wrist unit steadied into a plateau, still high but no longer climbing. This meant the flare had reached its peak. Surviving the peak didn't mean safety, though. The intensity would linger, burning hard for a while before beginning its slow decline. He stayed alert, ready to reinforce the shelter if the algae began to dry or thin. As he lay there, he found himself thinking of the moment he would emerge. The heat and glare outside would still be dangerous, but the thought of stepping out alive while others had fallen stirred something stubborn in his chest. It wasn't pride. Pride could be as fatal as recklessness. It was the quiet satisfaction of having trusted observation over bravado. A faint creak overhead signaled the algae flexing under another surge. He pressed upward gently with his palms, sharing the load until the tension eased. It was an odd partnership, a human and a living mat of alien plant matter facing down a force of nature together. He realized with a wry, private smile that if anyone had told him a month ago this would be his lifeline, he would have laughed. Now, it was the only reason his skin wasn't blistering under a merciless sky. He kept his focus locked on the present, knowing that even a few careless moments could undo all the work. Somewhere out there on the flats, the suns still roared their invisible fire, but here under the algae, in the dim and humid quiet, he was holding his ground. The peak had come, and he was still in the fight. The first hint that the flare had begun to wane was not a drop in the heat, but a change in the way the algae felt under his hands. The fibers no longer thrummed with the same tense energy. Instead, they had settled into a slow, steady pulse, like the plant itself was beginning to exhale after holding its breath for hours. He kept still at first, wary of being fooled. The radiation readings on his wrist unit confirmed it only minutes later. Numbers that had plateaued now showed the slightest downward drift. The flare was easing, but the danger had not passed. He knew from the briefing that the decline could be deceptive. The sun's fury would fade unevenly, sometimes spiking without warning before finally retreating. Many cadets in previous years had made the mistake of leaving shelter too early, only to be caught in a sudden burst that undid all their endurance. He would not be one of them. The air inside his shelter was heavier now, saturated with the damp heat of hours spent in close quarters. Condensation clung to his visor, smearing the green light into blurs. He raised a gloved hand and wiped it clear, careful not to press against the algae overhead. His shoulders ached from holding the same position, and his legs tingled from the lack of movement, but he forced himself to stay calm. He shifted only enough to keep his circulation steady, stretching his calves against the packed sediment floor of the basin. Outside, the muffled world was beginning to sound different. The sharp pops and cracks that had marked the flare's peak were less frequent now. Instead, he could make out the faint lapping of water on the flats, a sound that had been absent for most of the test. It was as if the planet itself had begun to stir again after hours of holding still under the sun's assault. He thought about the other cadets. Some would still be clinging to their shelters, praying their materials held long enough for the danger to pass. Others, those whose defenses had failed, would already have been pulled to safety by the med drones, their test over, their reputations wounded. He knew that when this was over, the survivors would be judged not only by whether they had lasted, but by how they had lasted. The instructors cared about method as much as result. Brute endurance without intelligence was considered luck, and luck had no place in the Academy's hierarchy. A faint scraping sound broke into his thoughts. It was coming from the left side of his shelter, just beyond the edge where the mat draped over the basin lip. It wasn't the shifting of algae or the settling of rock. It was rhythmic, deliberate. He froze, listening. After a moment, a voice called out, muffled but distinct enough to recognize. It was the avian cadet who had mocked him earlier. Her tone was strained, urgent. She called his name once more, followed by a short, clipped request for water. He hesitated. The rules did not forbid helping another cadet during the test, but exposing himself now, even partially, carried serious risk. He thought of the spikes that could still erupt from the flare without warning. Yet the voice outside sounded weaker with each call. Finally, he slid forward and lifted one edge of the mat by only a few centimeters, keeping most of his body still under cover. Through the narrow gap, he saw her crouched low, her reflective shelter sheet crumpled at her side, one wing hanging limply. The heat had reddened the skin around her eyes, and her beak clicked with each shallow breath. Without speaking, he reached for his water bottle, twisted the cap, and extended it through the opening. She took it with a trembling claw, drank in short bursts, and then pushed it back toward him with a nod that was more instinct than gratitude. He lowered the mat immediately, sealing himself in again. The brief exposure left his pulse pounding. His wrist unit showed no significant spike in radiation, but the air inside the shelter now felt hotter against his faceplate. He shifted back into position and steadied his breathing, reminding himself that the algae was still functioning as his primary shield. It had held for this long. It could hold until the flare truly ended. He took another reading. Radiation levels were continuing to drop, now at less than half the peak. Relief threatened to loosen his focus, but he kept his mind anchored. This was the stage when mistakes happened. Equipment was left unsecured, shelters were abandoned prematurely, and exhaustion pushed survivors into carelessness. Time blurred. He alternated between monitoring the algae's condition and checking his readings. The plant was still damp, though the outermost layer felt warmer now. He shifted a smaller braid section from the side to the center, reinforcing the shield above his head. The water beneath the mat was cooler than the air by several degrees, and each time he adjusted the layers, a faint chill brushed against his gloves. A small reminder that nature had given him a resource no manufactured shield could match. Eventually, the radiation readings dipped into the range the instructors had designated as safe for limited exposure. He knew the term well enough to translate it in his mind, safe for a quick exit, not for wandering the flats. He began dismantling his shelter slowly, starting with the smaller braid sections, which he coiled and set aside. When he lifted the main mat, steam curled from its surface into the cooling air. He draped it carefully over his shoulder, not wanting to damage it. Whether the Academy cared about it or not, he saw its value now as something beyond the test. The reflective sheet beneath was warm but intact, the mineral crust beneath it only slightly cracked. He stepped out of the basin into the open flats for the first time in hours. The light was still harsh but no longer the blinding, oppressive white of the flare's peak. The sky above shimmered faintly, the afterimage of the sun's outburst slowly dissolving. In the distance, he could see movement. Cadets emerging from their shelters, med drones gliding low over the terrain, scanning for stragglers. He adjusted the mat on his shoulder and began walking toward the platform, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp sediment. Each step felt heavier than it should have, the combined weight of fatigue and the strange, quiet satisfaction of having endured. As he neared the platform, he passed the avian cadet. She was sitting on a low ridge, drinking from a ration pouch while a med drone scanned her wing. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and gave a short nod. It was not an apology, but it was something. He returned the gesture and kept moving. Commander Ulan stood at the base of the gangway, her gaze sweeping over each returning cadet. When his turn came, her eyes flicked to the mat on his shoulder, then to his face. She said nothing, but the faintest shift in her expression suggested acknowledgement. Not praise, not yet, but recognition. He climbed the gangway without a word, the sound of his boots on the metal steps loud in the returning normalcy of the world. The test was over, but the real reckoning of performance, of choices made under pressure, was still to come, and he intended to meet it with the same quiet steadiness that had carried him through the worst of the sun's fury. The platform's deck still radiated the day's stored heat as he stepped onto it, the faint smell of scorched salt clinging to the metal. The instructors had gathered the cadets into a loose semicircle, their faces hidden behind reflective visors, the kind that gave away nothing. He joined the group quietly, the algae mat still draped over his shoulder, damp edges dripping in slow intervals onto the decking. Around him, cadets stood in varying states of wear, some with armor scorched or warped, some with reflective sheets torn or dangling in strips, and some, fewer than he expected, looking relatively unscathed. The med drones hovered at the periphery, silent witnesses now that the worst was over. Commander Ulan paced along the line, stopping briefly at each cadet to inspect equipment, posture, and the look in the eyes behind the visors. She didn't ask questions. She simply looked, took in details, and moved on. When she reached him, her gaze lingered on the algae mat. He could see his own reflection in her visor, the green-black mass over his shoulder standing out against the silver sky behind them. She said nothing, only gave a short nod and stepped past him to continue her inspection. That nod, small as it was, felt heavier than any spoken praise. When the inspection ended, the instructors dismissed the group to the debriefing hall. The hall was a wide, circular chamber with no windows and a floor made of pale stone that absorbed sound, creating a heavy, close quiet. Cadets filed in and took seats on the tiered benches, their movements slow with exhaustion. At the center stood an instructor with a hollow screen that flared to life as soon as the last seat was filled. The first image was a map of the flats during the flare, marked with glowing dots for each cadet's location. His dot stayed fixed in the basin for nearly the entire duration, barely shifting except for small adjustments. Other dots told different stories. some moving constantly in search of better cover, some vanishing early when med drones evacuated their owners. The instructor began speaking, not with congratulations but with analysis. She pointed out mistakes, shelters pitched too close to heat-reflective surfaces, unnecessary movement that exposed cadets to spikes, reliance on equipment without accounting for environmental factors. No names were mentioned, but every cadet knew which dot belonged to whom. When his position came up on the display, the instructor paused. She didn't praise him outright, but her words carried weight. Minimal movement, stable location, integration of indigenous material with issued equipment. This is a survival pattern worth noting. Her tone remained clinical, yet the implication was clear. He had not only endured, but done so with intent. The algae mat now lay beside his seat, damp edges curling slightly as it dried in the hall's cooler air. Some cadets glanced at it with curiosity, others with the reluctant acknowledgement that they had underestimated its value. The avian cadet, seated 2 rows up, turned her head just enough to meet his eyes for a moment before looking forward again. There was no smile, no verbal concession, but the silence between them had shifted into something less sharp. After the debriefing, the cadets were released to their quarters. He carried the mat with him instead of leaving it in the equipment bay. The corridors were quiet, footsteps echoing off metal walls. In his small room, he set the mat down carefully, folding it so the damp layers faced inward to preserve their texture. He didn't know if he would ever need it again, but it felt wrong to discard something that had quite literally stood between him and the suns. Sitting on the edge of his bunk, he replayed the day's events in his mind. Not the moments of strain or heat, but the decisions. Choosing the basin, layering the shelter with the mat, resisting the urge to move when every instinct demanded action. It struck him how much of survival came down to resisting impulses, to trusting preparation over reaction. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. It was a message from Commander Ulan, short and direct. Report to my office at 0700. There was no explanation, but he suspected it would concern the report on the test. Whether she intended to commend him, question him, or simply record his methods for future training, he couldn't say. He powered down the message and lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the platform's systems filled the quiet, steady, and unchanging. His body ached, but it was the satisfying ache of effort spent well. Outside, the twin suns were dipping toward the horizon, their light softening as Neros turned away from them. The ocean's surface would already be cooling, the algae mats settling back into their gentle tidal rhythm, indifferent to the trials of the day. As he closed his eyes, he thought about how the flare would be spoken of among the cadets in the weeks to come. Stories would grow, details would bend, and reputations would shift. His own story might be told as a clever trick or as a stubborn gamble, depending on who told it. That didn't matter to him. What mattered was the quiet certainty that when the suns had been at their fiercest, he had not faltered. The mat's damp weight had been real beneath his hands, the shelter solid around him, and his mind clear enough to see the path forward. In the end, survival was less about what the flare had done and more about what he had chosen to do in its light. And with that thought, he let sleep take him, the fading heat of the day still lingering in the walls, a reminder of the trial that had passed and the ones still to come.